I sacrificed my youth working double shifts to give my son everything only to stand in my own hallway and overhear him coldly planning to lock me in a memory care facility so he could steal my home equity. The betrayal shattered my heart, but instead of begging for his love, I relied on my 40 years as an emergency room trauma nurse. I quietly cashed out my assets, packed my bags, and left them with a single handwritten note. Enjoy paying the new corporate landlord's rent. I was standing perfectly still in my own hallway, holding a silver tray with a glass pitcher of sweet tea and 3 crystal glasses. My hands were entirely steady. Through the narrow crack in the heavy oak dining room door, I could clearly see my son Bradley, his wife Chloe, and her sister Jessica leaning over my mahogany table. They were passing a thick, glossy brochure back and forth. The ice in my pitcher shifted, making a soft clinking sound, but they were too deeply engaged in their financial planning to hear it. I had spent 40 years as an emergency room charge nurse at a busy metropolitan hospital. When the trauma monitor starts screaming and a patient crashes, panic is the absolute fastest way to lose a life. You do not shout. You do not freeze. You absorb the data, you assess the hemorrhage, and you secure the airway. Standing in that hallway, listening to my own flesh and blood, I treated my family exactly like a code blue. Bradley leaned forward and tapped the glossy brochure with his index finger. His voice was flat, careful, and entirely devoid of the warmth he used when speaking to my face. The memory care wing is $6,000 a month, he said, but Jessica says the house will appraise at $1.5 million. We can use the equity to cover my debt and upgrade Chloe's business. Mom won't even realize what's happening until the paperwork is signed. The words hung in the air of my home. The home my late husband William and I had paid for with decades of quiet, relentless labor. William had been a commercial insurance underwriter, a man who assessed risk for a living. I had spent my life keeping people alive. Together we had built a fortress of security for our only son. And now that same son was calculating the exact price of my erasure. Jessica nodded, her polished real estate agent smile firmly in place. She smoothed her sharp linen suit and slid a printed spreadsheet across my table. The market is incredibly hot for this neighborhood right now, she murmured. We get her declared unfit, secure the conservatorship, and we can list this property by next month. The equity alone will wipe out your outstanding loans, Bradley, and Chloe can finally rebrand her event company. I did not drop the tray. I did not push the door open and demand an explanation. I did not fall to my knees and weep for the little boy I used to carry to bed when he fell asleep doing his 7th grade homework. Grief is a luxury you cannot afford when you are standing in the middle of an active ambush. I stood there and breathed. I took their exact words, their calculating tone, their clinical precision, and I filed it all away into the coldest part of my mind. I adjusted my grip on the silver tray, painted a warm maternal smile onto my face, and pushed the dining room door wide open. The reaction was immediate and beautifully chaotic. Chloe gasped and slammed her elbow down onto the glossy brochure, knocking over an empty water glass in her absolute panic. Bradley jumped back from the table, his face instantly draining of color, while Jessica quickly shuffled the printed spreadsheet into her designer leather tote bag. They looked exactly like startled thieves caught in the act, which of course is precisely what they were. I stepped into the room with absolute calm, letting my smile reach my eyes. I thought you all might be getting thirsty discussing real estate, I said smoothly, setting the heavy tray down in the center of the table right beside the damp edge of the spilled water. Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically to gauge my expression. Oh, thanks, Mom. He forced a strained laugh. We were just looking at some investment properties for Jessica. Nothing important. Chloe, recovering her composure with the speed of a woman accustomed to staging reality for a living, immediately went on the offensive. She looked down at the tray and let out an exaggerated, deeply patronizing sigh. Oh, Evelyn, she said, using the sweet, high-pitched voice people reserve for speaking to a confused toddler. You forgot the napkins again. We talked about this. Are you sure you are feeling okay today? You have been so forgetful lately. There it was, the opening maneuver, the tiny calculated microaggression designed to lay the groundwork for a medical narrative. She was building a history of cognitive decline right in front of me, piece by piece, starting with a forgotten paper napkin. A younger version of myself would have been deeply offended. A more emotional mother would have argued back and defended her own sanity. But the woman standing in that dining room was a charge nurse actively assessing a threat. I let my shoulders drop slightly. I widened my eyes to perfectly mimic the gentle confusion of an aging woman slowly losing her grip on the present moment. "Oh my goodness," I murmured, bringing a hand to my cheek and letting my voice waver just a fraction. "You are absolutely right, Chloe. I do not know where my mind went just now. I will go grab those napkins right away." "I am so sorry, sweetheart." Chloe exchanged a knowing, triumphant glance with Jessica. Bradley visibly relaxed, his tense shoulders dropping as he exhaled a breath he had been holding. They genuinely believed I was fragile. They thought my mind was fading and my spirit was softening into easy compliance. They had absolutely no idea that I had just become a silent, active observer in my own home, quietly gathering the vital signs of their massive betrayal. As I turned my back to walk toward the kitchen, my gentle smile vanished completely. They wanted to play a medical game with a woman who had spent 40 years charting symptoms. I was perfectly willing to play along until it was time to pull the plug. The gaslighting campaign began less than 12 hours later. I woke up at my usual time of 5 in the morning and walked downstairs to the kitchen to prepare my coffee. I reached for the small ceramic bowl near the front door where I have kept my car keys and my leather checkbook for the past 30 years. The bowl was completely empty. I did not panic. I simply stood there and let the reality of their next move wash over me. They were manufacturing a crisis of memory. By 7 o'clock, Bradley walked into the kitchen wearing a crisp suit and a deeply fake expression of gentle concern. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching me search the living room. "Mom, are you looking for something?" he asked, his voice dripping with that same patronizing sweetness Chloe had used the night before. I turned around and kept my face perfectly neutral. "I cannot seem to find my car keys or my checkbook, Bradley. I always leave them in the bowl." Bradley sighed heavily and rubbed the back of his neck like a man carrying an unbearable burden. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, stepping closer and placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You have been slipping lately. Missing details. Forgetting conversations. Chloe and I are really starting to worry about you driving. Maybe it is best if you stay home today. The streets are dangerous for someone who is getting confused." I looked at my son. He was lying straight to my face with the practiced ease of a man desperate for a payout. I patted his hand softly. "You are such a good son to worry about me," I whispered, playing the role he had written for me perfectly. "I will just stay in and rest today." Bradley smiled, a tight, victorious smile kissed my cheek, and left for his office feeling entirely satisfied with his handiwork. 10 minutes after his car pulled out of the driveway, I walked straight into the guest bedroom where Chloe had left her oversized designer handbag on the bed. I did not tear the room apart. I simply opened the clasp and reached past her expensive cosmetics. Right at the very bottom, beneath a leather wallet, lay my car keys and my checkbook. I stared at them for a long time. They were treating me like a prisoner in the house William and I had built. I did not confront Chloe when she finally came downstairs. I did not scream or demand my property. Doing so would only allow them to claim I was prone to emotional outbursts. Instead, I quietly used a spare key from my lockbox, drove myself to the hardware store, and had 3 new sets made. On the way home, I stopped at an electronics store and purchased a small voice-activated digital recorder. When I returned, I nested it deeply inside the fake fruit bowl on the kitchen island right where they held their daily strategy sessions. The campaign escalated rapidly 2 days later, when Bradley insisted on taking a morning off from work to drive me to a routine wellness check. He stood in the hallway holding his car keys and told me with manufactured warmth that a good son should always accompany his mother to her medical appointments. I agreed easily, because fighting him would only feed his carefully constructed narrative of my supposed combativeness. I sat quietly in the passenger seat as Bradley navigated through the heavy city traffic. However, I noticed immediately when he bypassed the familiar exit for my regular general practitioner. We drove into an upscale medical plaza on the west side of town instead. When he parked the car, I looked up at the polished brass sign beside the entrance. It read, Sterling Geriatric Psychiatry and Memory Care. Bradley was not taking me for a wellness check. He was taking me to secure the medical foundation for his conservatorship. He guided me into the waiting room with a firm grip on my elbow, portraying the role of the devoted, exhausted caregiver for the receptionist. We sat in the plush chairs while he reviewed his notes on his phone. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Once we were inside the examination room, Bradley would answer every single question directed at me. He would talk over me, describe fabricated symptoms of dementia, and paint a picture of a woman who could no longer manage her own finances or safety. He needed a doctor to put the word decline onto official medical records. A young nurse in blue scrubs finally called my name and gestured toward a long hallway. Bradley immediately stood up and placed his hand on the small of my back, attempting to usher me forward. I stopped walking. The waiting room was quiet but full of people. I turned to my son and spoke in a clear, caring voice that easily reached the receptionist's desk. Bradley, I said pleasantly, but with absolute authority, you will wait here. Bradley froze, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Mom, do not be silly. He chuckled, trying to push me forward again. The doctor needs to hear from both of us. It is important that we discuss your recent memory episodes. I stepped completely out of his reach. I folded my hands together and looked directly into his eyes, tapping into 40 years of running a trauma ward. I am a retired medical professional, Bradley. I said, my tone dropping to ice. I am fully aware of my rights under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I do not consent to your presence in my medical examination, and I decline to release my protected health information to you. If you attempt to enter that room, I will ask the staff to have you escorted from the building. The entire waiting room fell dead silent. The young nurse stood perfectly still, her eyes wide. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but the clinical finality of my words left him with absolutely no maneuvering room. He could not force his way inside without causing a scene that would destroy his carefully crafted image. His face flushed a dark, angry red. I turned away from my son, left him fuming silently in the waiting room, and walked down the hallway alongside the nurse. I left the geriatric clinic that afternoon with a clean bill of health, but I knew a standard note from a stranger would never be enough to stop Bradley. He was building a malicious paper trail, and I needed a fortress to block his path. 2 days later, I drove myself across town to the sprawling campus of Memorial Hospital. I parked in the very same concrete employee garage I had used for 4 decades. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the neurology department, and the highly familiar smell of sterile alcohol and industrial floor wax immediately settled my nerves. I was not there as a retired charge nurse paying a social visit to old friends. I was there to secure my survival. I bypassed the crowded waiting area and knocked directly on the heavy mahogany door belonging to Dr. Jonathan Aris. We had run the trauma floor together for over 20 years before he transferred to a specialty in neurology. He knew my mind better than anyone else in that entire building. When he opened the door, his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. But his deeply ingrained medical instincts caught the coldness in my eyes immediately. I sat in the leather chair across from his massive desk, and I did not waste a single moment of his time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what my son and daughter-in-law were planning. I told him about the missing keys, the ambush appointment, and the glossy memory care brochure hidden in my dining room. Jonathan listened without interrupting once. His jaw tightened significantly, but he remained perfectly clinical. When I finished speaking, I leaned forward and looked him straight in the eye. I need a certified, rigorous cognitive evaluation, Jonathan, I said firmly. I need every test you have, and I need the results documented and officially notarized today. He did not hesitate or ask if I was overreacting. He pulled out the Montreal Cognitive Assessment forms, the clock drawing tests, and the extensive executive function evaluations. We spent the next 2 hours systematically working through the most strenuous psychological exams available in modern medicine. I drew the clock perfectly. I repeated the complicated word sequences backward and forward. I solved the complex mathematical deductions without a single moment of hesitation. I answered every question with the sharp, absolute clarity of a woman actively fighting for her freedom. When we finished, Jonathan quietly tallied the score. I scored a flawless 30 out of 30. He did not just sign his name at the bottom of the standard form. He immediately drafted a comprehensive sworn affidavit on official hospital letterhead. He wrote that my cognitive function was exceptional for my age, and that any future claim of mental incapacity would be entirely inconsistent with clinical reality. He stated undeniably that I possessed the complete mental acuity required to manage my estate and my finances independently. We walked down to the hospital administration office together and had the document officially stamped and notarized by the clerk. I folded that heavy sealed envelope carefully into my purse. Bradley was actively trying to build a cage out of medical lies, but I had just forged an unbreakable key. That same Friday evening, Bradley and Chloe enthusiastically announced they were attending an exclusive investor dinner downtown. They dressed in their finest tailored clothes, sprayed on incredibly expensive cologne and perfume, and kissed my cheek while falsely telling me to get some good rest. The moment their leased luxury sedan finally disappeared down the street, I immediately went to work. I knew their deep desperation had a specific source, and I desperately needed to find the exact coordinates of their impending ruin. I walked straight down the hallway and into Bradley's home office. He always kept the door locked to protect his privacy, but he had foolishly forgotten that I still kept the original master key safely hidden inside my bedroom nightstand. The office was impeccably staged to look like the pristine workspace of a highly successful corporate executive. But an emergency room nurse inherently knows how to look past the healthy exterior to locate the internal bleeding. I ignored his polished mahogany desk and went directly to the heavy black paper shredder sitting in the corner of the room. Inside the plastic bin, I found a thick, dense mound of freshly shredded paper. Desperate people constantly make careless mistakes, and Bradley had neglected to empty the bin before leaving. I gathered the shreds, placed them carefully into a large, clear bag, and carried them directly to my wide kitchen table. For the next 4 hours, I sat quietly under the bright overhead light, painstakingly piecing the jagged strips of paper back together using clear tape. It was incredibly tedious and grueling work, but extreme patience is a mandatory requirement for survival. Slowly, the terrifying true shape of my son's life began to clearly reveal itself across my kitchen table. The very first document I managed to reconstruct was a severe final notice from a commercial lender. Chloe's luxury event planning business was not expanding at all. It was completely and hopelessly bankrupt. She had defaulted on multiple massive vendor loans, and the angry creditors were actively preparing to seize her remaining business assets. But the second document I taped together was far worse. It was a drafted internal audit notice originating from Bradley's corporate employer. My hands went completely still as I read the broken lines of text. Bradley had been quietly embezzling company funds for months to artificially keep Chloe's failing business afloat. He had systematically fabricated vendor invoices and funneled the stolen money directly into hidden accounts to cover their extravagant daily lifestyle. The total amount stolen was utterly staggering. $300,000 in completely hidden, crippling debt. The corporate audit was scheduled to formally conclude by the end of the month. Once the corporation finalized their undeniable findings, my son would face immediate termination and severe felony fraud charges. Prison was an absolute certainty unless he could magically produce the missing funds to quietly cover his tracks before the final report was officially submitted. I sat back in my chair and stared blankly at the taped pages. Everything finally made perfect, terrifying sense. They were not merely acting out of casual greed. They were deeply trapped in a burning building of their own making. My house, with its $1.5 million in untouched equity, was their only fire escape. They urgently needed me. Declared completely incompetent, so they could immediately drain my lifetime of assets to avoid absolute financial and criminal ruin. The delivery driver dropped the heavy cardboard envelope on my front porch just before noon. I saw the familiar logo of my primary bank printed strictly across the front. The package was addressed to Bradley, but the delivery address was my home. That was his first tactical error. Desperate people always become sloppy when they rush. I did not wait for him to return from his office to claim it. I took a sharp kitchen knife, sliced the sealed top open, and slid the thick stack of papers directly onto my granite counter. My 40 years of charting complex medical records had taught me to read fine print with unrelenting focus. I needed to see exactly how fast the financial poison was spreading through my home. The very first page was a formal notification regarding a pending application for a $400,000 home equity line of credit. The loan was drawn directly against the deed to my property. The property William and I had paid off completely 10 years ago. My heart beat steadily. I did not panic or cry. I simply turned to the next page to see how my son had magically bypassed the strict bank security protocols. There it was attached right behind the primary loan application, a comprehensive, durable power of attorney document. It claimed that I had willingly surrendered total financial control of my entire estate over to Bradley. It specifically cited severe cognitive decline as the activating legal condition. I stared down at the bottom of the heavy page. There was my signature looping perfectly in dark blue ink. But it was not my signature. It was an incredibly careful, meticulously traced forgery. Right beside the forged signature was an official state notary stamp legally authenticating the completely fraudulent document. I leaned over the counter and looked very closely at the name printed on the circular stamp. It belonged to an administrative employee working directly out of Jessica's real estate office. Chloe's sister had just crossed the permanent line from a greedy real estate agent to an active accomplice in a massive financial crime. They had officially escalated their cowardly plan from simple emotional manipulation to a fully documented felony. Forging a signature to secure a $400,000 loan against an elderly woman's home is a serious federal offense. They were so blinded by their impending bankruptcy that they genuinely believed they could push this massive loan through the banking system before I ever checked my own mail. They thought my mind was too clouded to understand basic financial terms. I carefully placed the forged documents safely inside a heavy plastic sleeve and locked them securely inside my bedroom safe. I had gathered enough lethal evidence to burn their entire scheme to the ground, but I needed them to walk fully into the trap before I struck the match. I needed them to feel completely safe. The absolute audacity of their plan became fully visible the very next morning. I was sitting quietly in my living room sipping black coffee when my front door swung wide open. Jessica strolled inside completely unannounced, carrying a heavy metal clipboard and a large industrial tape measure. Walking right behind her was a burly man wearing a dirty construction shirt and heavy work boots. They did not bother to knock. They did not bother to greet me. They simply marched directly into the center of my home like they already held the deed in their greedy hands. Jessica pointed her polished fingernail toward the main wall separating the kitchen and the formal dining room. "We need to tear this entire section completely down," she announced loudly to the contractor. "It absolutely blocks the natural light, and modern wealthy buyers demand a completely open concept floor plan. If we take out this load-bearing wall, we can easily add $50,000 to the final resale value." The contractor nodded in agreement and immediately started pulling his tape measure across my hardwood floor. I set my coffee cup down on the table with a single firm click. I stood up and walked directly toward them. My posture was perfectly straight and my voice was completely devoid of any emotion. "Excuse me," I said clearly. "What exactly are you doing inside my house?" Jessica turned to look at me and let out a long, deeply exasperated sigh. She rolled her eyes and adopted the same sickly sweet tone my son had been using all week. "Oh, Evelyn, please do not worry yourself," she said dismissively. "Bradley and Chloe asked me to bring a contractor by today to get some early estimates for a minor property renovation. It really is not your decision anymore, sweetheart. You just go sit back down in your comfortable chair and let us handle the difficult things." She smiled a venomous little smile and turned her back to me. I did not raise my voice. I did not bother arguing with a manipulative real estate agent. I simply looked at the man holding the tape measure. "Sir," I said, maintaining absolute clinical eye contact, "I am the sole legal owner of this property. I did not hire you, and I do not give you legal permission to stand inside my home. If you do not walk out that front door in the next 30 seconds, I will call the police and have you formally charged with criminal trespassing." The contractor completely froze. He looked at Jessica and then looked back at my completely unyielding expression. He recognized immediately that I was not a confused old woman playing silly games. He quickly reeled in his tape measure, muttered a frantic apology, and practically ran out the front door. Jessica stood frozen in the hallway, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. Before she could speak, Bradley burst through the front door. He had clearly been waiting in his car outside the entire time. He stormed into the living room, his face tight with furious indignation. "Mom, what is wrong with you?" he shouted, pointing an angry finger at me. "Jessica is doing us a massive favor. You are being completely irrational and terribly ungrateful. You cannot even manage your own car keys, and now you are chasing away trained professionals trying to help this family." I looked at my son throwing his terrible tantrum in the middle of my living room. I vividly remembered the forged bank document sitting securely inside my safe. I nodded slowly, playing the fragile mother one last time. "You are right, Bradley," I whispered, lowering my eyes to hide the coldness burning inside them. "I am just feeling very overwhelmed today. I will try to be better." He huffed loudly and walked away, feeling like a victorious king. He had absolutely no idea his kingdom was built entirely on a trapdoor. The atmosphere in the house shifted precisely at 7 o'clock that evening. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when Bradley and Chloe walked into the room together. They moved with a stiff rehearsed synchronization. Bradley held a thick manila folder in his right hand, while Chloe carried a counterfeit expression of deep sorrow on her face. They guided me into the formal dining room and firmly asked me to sit down. This was not a casual conversation about my health. This was a highly orchestrated ambush designed to force my hand. Bradley placed the manila folder directly in the center of my dark mahogany table. He opened it slowly and deliberately. Inside sat the glossy memory care brochure I had seen Jessica holding days earlier. Beside it, he placed a crisp legal document. It was a pre-drafted quitclaim deed, ready to instantly transfer the absolute ownership of my entire property over to him. "Mom, we need to have a very difficult conversation," Bradley said. His voice was completely flat. It lacked any trace of the nervous son he used to be. It was the voice of a man reciting a calculated legal threat. "You are not safe living here anymore. Chloe and I have watched you decline rapidly over the past few months. You are forgetting things. You are becoming aggressive with contractors. You are becoming a danger to yourself." I sat perfectly still with my hands folded in my lap. I looked down at the quitclaim deed. It was the final puzzle piece of their magnificent fraud. "We found a beautiful place for you," Chloe chimed in. She tapped the glossy brochure with a polished fingernail. "It has 24-hour nursing staff and wonderful gardens. You will be so well cared for there. But memory care is incredibly expensive, Evelyn. Bradley and I cannot possibly afford it on our own." Bradley leaned forward, pressing his hands flat against the table. He dropped the caring son routine entirely, and the air in the room turned freezing cold. "Here is the reality, Mom," he stated, his eyes narrowing. "You are going to sign this house over to me tonight. We will use the equity to fund your care. If you refuse me, I will go to court tomorrow morning. I have an entire medical file documenting your mental collapse. I will file for an emergency conservatorship and have a judge declare you legally unfit to manage your own life." He pointed a rigid finger at the legal document. "If you fight me, you will lose everything. The state will strip you of your assets. They will place you in a bleak, underfunded public facility, and you will have absolutely no control over your remaining years. Sign the paper, Mom. It is for your own protection." I looked into the eyes of the boy I had carried in my womb. I saw nothing but a hollow, desperate man staring back at me. He was standing on the edge of a $300,000 cliff of embezzlement, and he was entirely willing to throw his own mother over the edge to save himself. In a busy emergency room, you quickly learn that arguing with a cornered, terrified person is completely useless. When a patient is thrashing wildly in trauma, you do not try to debate their reality. You employ tactical de-escalation. You tell them whatever they need to hear until you can safely secure the restraints and neutralize the immediate threat. Bradley was thoroughly cornered by his massive corporate embezzlement, and Chloe was cornered by her bankrupt luxury event business. If I fought them tonight, they would panic and escalate their legal assault immediately. I needed time. I needed them to drop their defenses completely and leave the house. So I gave them exactly the performance they desperately wanted to see. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward heavily. I looked down at the mahogany table and I let my breathing turn shallow and ragged. I closed my eyes and allowed the tears to fall. They were not fake tears. I was crying with absolute genuine grief. I was mourning the final death of the son I had raised. The sweet boy who used to build model airplanes on this very table was gone forever. I wept for the man he could have been and the cruel monster he had chosen to become. "You win," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "I am just so tired, Bradley. I am so tired of fighting you." Bradley immediately exhaled a massive breath of relief. Chloe reached across the table and patted my hand with a sickening display of false maternal affection. "We know it is hard, Evelyn," she murmured happily, "but you are doing the right thing for everyone." I looked up at them with wet, defeated eyes. "I will sign the deed over to you," I said softly. "But please, just give me 1 week. Let me have 7 days to pack up 40 years of memories. Let me say goodbye to my home in peace. After 1 week, I will sign whatever you want, and I will go quietly to the facility." Bradley and Chloe exchanged a rapid, triumphant glance. They had won. They truly believed they had completely broken my spirit and secured their $1.5 million lifeline. Bradley snatched the folder off the table. 1 week, Mom," he agreed generously. "We will handle all the arrangements. You just focus on resting." They did not even try to hide their absolute elation. The moment they stepped out of the dining room, the heavy mask of concern vanished entirely. I sat silently at the table, listening to them celebrate loudly in the kitchen. Chloe poured 2 glasses of expensive wine. Bradley began talking rapidly about booking a first-class trip. "We deserve a reward for dealing with this nightmare," Chloe squealed happily. "Let us book those tickets to St. Bart's tonight. We can use the last of my credit cards. Once the house clears, we will pay it all off instantly." I sat in the dimming light of the dining room, wiping the last tear from my cheek. My grief vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp clinical focus. They had arrogantly booked a 5-day luxury vacation to the Caribbean to celebrate their incoming wealth. They thought they had trapped a confused, fragile old woman. They had no idea they had just given a highly trained trauma nurse 5 uninterrupted days to surgically dismantle their entire existence. The black luxury car pulled out of my driveway at exactly 6 in the morning. I stood quietly by the front window and watched Bradley and Chloe drive away for their flight to St. Bart's. They were laughing loudly as they loaded their designer luggage into the trunk, utterly convinced they had secured their financial salvation. I did not move from the glass until their car turned the corner. Then I walked to my computer and pulled up a flight tracking application. I waited with absolute patience until the system confirmed their plane had officially left the runway. The moment they were 30,000 feet in the air over the Atlantic Ocean, my morning widow routine permanently ended. I walked straight into my home office and picked up the telephone. I did not call a traditional real estate agent. Traditional home sales require open houses, staging negotiations, and months of waiting. I did not have months. I had exactly 7 days. Instead, I dialed the direct private line for Apex Holdings. Apex was not a family-friendly neighborhood brokerage. They were a massive, ruthless corporate property acquisition firm. They were famous throughout the city for executing aggressive cash buyouts, completely stripping properties of any sentimentality, and employing a notoriously unforgiving tenant management division. They did not care about family memories or preserving historic charm. They cared entirely about fast transactions and wide profit margins. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting perfectly upright in a freezing glass conference room downtown. Sitting directly across from me was Marcus Thorne, the lead acquisitions director for Apex Holdings. He was a man who wore a sharp gray suit and possessed the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned predator. He did not offer me coffee or pretend to care about why a woman my age was suddenly selling her home. He simply placed a blank legal pad on the polished table and waited for my pitch. I slid a thick folder of property documents across the glass table. I own a fully updated 4-bedroom estate in the historic district, I stated with absolute clinical precision. The property is completely unencumbered by mortgages or financial liens. The current market value is easily $1.5 million. I will sell it to Apex Holdings today for $1.3 million in pure cash. Marcus paused, his pen hovering over the legal pad. A $200,000 instant discount on a prime piece of real estate was an incredibly rare opportunity. He looked at me closely, trying to find the hidden catch. "Why the massive discount?" he asked, his voice utterly flat. "Because I have one absolute non-negotiable condition," I replied, leaning forward slightly to match his intensity. "I require an expedited, flawless 7-day closing. The funds must be transferred into an offshore trust by next Friday, and the title must legally change hands before my son returns from his vacation." Marcus studied my face for 10 seconds. He recognized a highly motivated seller who knew exactly what she was doing. He simply nodded his head and picked up his pen. "We have a deal, Evelyn," he said smoothly. "But my inspector needs to walk through the property today." The Apex Holdings inspector arrived at my house less than 3 hours later. His name was David, and he moved with the same clinical, ruthless efficiency as his boss. He did not compliment my beautiful crown molding or admire the custom hardwood floors William had installed. He simply tapped on load-bearing walls, checked the foundation lines, and rapidly typed raw data into his digital tablet. We were moving quickly through the downstairs living room when the sharp, piercing sound of the front doorbell shattered the quiet atmosphere. Before I could even reach the entryway, the heavy wooden door swung open. Jessica strutted into my foyer, carrying 2 massive shopping bags, overflowing with decorative throw pillows and expensive staging towels. She had let herself in using the spare key Chloe had undoubtedly given her. She froze the moment she saw a strange man standing in the middle of the living room, holding an electronic clipboard. "Well, hello," Jessica announced, her voice dripping with sudden intense suspicion. She narrowed her eyes at David and then glared directly at me. "Evelyn, who exactly is this? We are not supposed to have any unauthorized visitors right now. Bradley was very clear about keeping you resting." A lesser woman would have panicked. A normal mother would have stumbled over her words while trying to invent a believable lie to hide a secret corporate appraisal. But 40 years of directing a chaotic emergency room had taught me exactly how to lie with flawless, absolute authority. I did not break eye contact with Jessica. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and rubbed my temples, simulating extreme exhaustion. "Oh, Jessica, thank goodness you are here," I said, my voice perfectly adopting the fragile, exhausted tone of a highly confused old woman. "This nice man is David," I continued, pointing a trembling finger toward the inspector. "He is a plumber from the city." I noticed a terrible leak coming from the master bathroom upstairs, and I was so worried it might completely ruin the downstairs ceiling. Bradley told me to handle emergencies, so I called the repair service right away. I looked at David and gave him a tiny, imperceptible nod. He was a corporate acquisitions inspector trained to handle hostile tenants and sudden legal complications. He instantly understood the assignment and adapted without missing a single beat. He offered Jessica a polite, exhausted smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said smoothly, tapping his tablet. "Looks like a slow pressure leak in the primary valve. I'm just mapping out the drywall access points before I go grab my tools from the truck. Jessica's deep suspicion vanished instantly, replaced by sheer profound annoyance. She dramatically rolled her eyes and dropped her heavy staging bags onto my pristine sofa. "Honestly, Evelyn, you really need to let us handle these things," she sneered dismissively. "You are going to get ripped off hiring random people." "Just finish up quickly," she snapped, turning her attention back to David. "We are staging this house next week, and I cannot have water damage ruining my open house." I smiled warmly at her, playing the grateful victim to absolute perfection. "You are so right, Jessica," I whispered meekly. I then led the corporate buyer directly past her, easily guiding him through the rest of the detailed property inspection right under her arrogant, completely oblivious nose. The mahogany table in Arthur Pendleton's office felt freezing cold beneath my hands. Arthur had been William's trusted estate attorney for over 30 years. He was a man who deeply appreciated absolute silence and bulletproof legal structures. Sitting directly across from us was Marcus Thorne from Apex Holdings. The final closing documents for the rapid cash sale of my home were stacked neatly between us. There was absolutely no hesitation in my fingers as I picked up the heavy brass pen. I signed my name on the final line, officially transferring the absolute legal ownership of my $1.5 million property over to the corporate acquisition firm for exactly $1.3 million in pure liquid cash. Marcus reached for the finished paperwork, but Arthur placed his hand flat over the pages, stopping him. Before the title company could officially record the transfer, Arthur presented the sealed envelope containing Dr. Jonathan Aris's sworn cognitive affidavit. He strictly instructed the title agent to file the rigorous medical certification directly alongside the property deed transfer. This was an incredibly crucial tactical maneuver. By attaching a flawless psychiatric evaluation to the exact moment of the real estate sale, we quickly erected an impenetrable legal wall. Bradley could scream and cry to a judge later, but he could never legally contest the ultimate validity of the transaction. The medical record legally cemented my complete mental competence beyond any shadow of a doubt. Marcus carefully reviewed the affidavit, gave a sharp nod of professional respect, and authorized the immediate wire transfer. Within 10 minutes, my local bank account registered a massive cash deposit. But the money did not stay there for long. I knew that the absolute second Bradley realized the house was permanently gone, he would immediately attempt to freeze my local assets using his fabricated narrative of my dementia. He would try to trap my money inside the state banking system. I completely severed that terrible vulnerability. Arthur immediately executed a highly complex generation-skipping trust located entirely offshore. The specific legal architecture of the private trust made it absolutely impossible for my deceitful son to access, trace, or freeze the funds. The trust was fully isolated from any domestic court order Bradley might try to manufacture. I sat completely still and watched Arthur quietly transfer the entire $1.3 million directly into the impenetrable offshore account. The moment the digital transfer officially cleared, I systematically closed every single local bank account bearing my name. I withdrew my remaining checking balance in cash and instructed the local branch manager to permanently erase my entire financial footprint from their institution. I left absolutely no forwarding address behind. I left no secondary accounts open. In less than an hour, I had completely vaporized my financial existence from my son's greedy reach. I was now fully armored. The corporate buyer shook my hand, took the heavy brass keys to my front door, and calmly walked out of the office. I remained seated in the quiet office with Arthur after the Apex Holdings representative departed. The rapid sale of the house had legally secured my financial freedom, but I was not entirely finished. Escaping the burning building was only the first step. I needed to make absolutely certain that the people who maliciously lit the fire were severely punished for their crimes. I reached deep into my leather purse and pulled out the heavy plastic sleeve. I slid it across the polished mahogany table directly toward Arthur. He slowly opened the sleeve and carefully withdrew the fraudulent home equity line of credit application and the forged durable power of attorney. I sat silently while he adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the documents. Arthur had meticulously drafted my actual legal paperwork for 3 decades. He knew exactly what my signature looked like, and he instantly recognized the amateur tracing job on the bottom line. He looked up at me, his expression completely hardened into pure professional outrage. "This is a severe federal offense, Evelyn," he stated plainly. His eyes moved directly to the official circular stamp, pressed right beside the fake signature. A fraudulent notary seal elevates this to a completely different level of criminal conspiracy. I nodded slowly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. My son and my daughter-in-law are actively attempting to steal $400,000 from my estate. Arthur, I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of any maternal weakness. And her sister Jessica knowingly abused her professional real estate credentials to illegally authenticate the forgery. They arrogantly believe I am too old and too confused to ever notice the banking mail arriving at my home. I want you to completely destroy them. Arthur did not offer any useless emotional sympathy. He did not ask me if I was emotionally prepared to send my only child to federal prison. He simply picked up his heavy pen and began writing a formal legal cover letter. He informed me that he would personally hand-deliver the forged banking application directly to the district attorney by the end of the afternoon. The financial fraud unit would immediately launch a full criminal investigation into Bradley and Chloe. But Arthur did not stop there. He made a pristine color copy of the fraudulent notary stamp and drafted a secondary aggressive complaint to the State Real Estate Commission. Jessica had foolishly gambled her entire professional career to help them steal my equity. The powerful commission would permanently revoke her real estate license before the criminal trial even formally began. I sat in the quiet office listening to the rhythmic sound of Arthur typing his legal demands. The heavy steel doors of my trap were now swinging shut on both the financial and criminal fronts. Bradley and Chloe were currently sitting on a pristine beach in St. Bart's, sipping expensive cocktails purchased with stolen corporate funds. They were happily toasting to their brilliant master plan. They had absolutely no idea that while they were swimming in the clear blue ocean, their mother had just signed the exact paperwork required to completely end their entire lives. I thanked Arthur, stood up, and walked out feeling utterly invincible. The moment my financial and legal defenses were permanently secured, I returned to the house to execute the final phase of my absolute erasure. Bradley and Chloe were currently thousands of miles away, basking in the bright Caribbean sun and posting arrogant vacation photographs on their various social media accounts. They had confidently given me 1 week to pack my personal belongings and silently submit to their terrifying nursing home plans. I only needed a single day to completely upend their reality. On Monday morning at exactly 8 a.m, a highly discreet and incredibly efficient professional moving team arrived at my front curb. I did not hire a massive commercial trucking company with bright painted logos on the side of their large vehicles. I hired a private boutique relocation service known specifically for executing rapid silent extractions for highly demanding clients. They parked their unmarked black trucks perfectly out of sight from the main street and walked through my front door completely ready to work. I stood in the center of the living room, holding a detailed clipboard, and gave the moving foreman his strict, unyielding instructions. I had 40 years of precious memories carefully stored inside those familiar walls, and I intended to remove every single trace of my existence in exactly 8 hours. The team moved through the large property with absolute surgical precision. They meticulously wrapped my delicate fine china in thick layers of protective padding and secured my heavy silver cutlery into locked metal transport cases. I watched 2 strong men carefully lift the antique grandfather clock belonging to William from the hallway floor. The clock had stood ticking in that exact spot since the day we carried Bradley home from the local maternity ward. I made absolutely certain that every genuine family heirloom, every original photograph, and every single piece of sentimental value was safely loaded into the waiting trucks. However, I was highly selective about what I chose to take with me. I walked through the formal dining room and the primary living spaces and explicitly instructed the movers to ignore the specific decorative items Chloe had rudely brought into my home. I left her cheap, poorly constructed modern chairs sitting exactly where she had placed them. I left the absurdly oversized abstract paintings she had hung on my beautiful walls to impress her wealthy clients. I deliberately abandoned every single throw pillow, decorative vase, and artificial plant Jessica had aggressively brought over for her foolish open house staging. They wanted the house to look like a glossy corporate advertisement, so I happily left them with their completely soulless artificial props. By 4 in the afternoon, the massive black trucks were fully loaded and the moving team quietly departed. I stood alone in the center of the living room, looking at the cheap gray curtains Chloe had hung over my windows. My entire physical life had been swiftly boxed up and safely transported away, leaving nothing behind but the hollow shell of the immense, unchecked greed of my son. The silence inside the empty house felt entirely different from any silence I had ever experienced before. For the first time in 40 years, my footsteps echoed sharply against the bare, polished hardwood floors. I walked slowly through the vacant downstairs rooms, allowing myself one final private tour of the life I was permanently leaving behind. I stepped into the empty space upstairs that used to be the nursery and looked up at the bare ceiling. I could vividly see the distinct memory of William standing on a tall wooden ladder, meticulously painting the walls a soft pale yellow, while we waited for our son to be born. I turned and looked toward the long, narrow hallway outside the master bedroom. I could clearly remember the exact afternoon a tiny toddler named Bradley had taken his very first clumsy steps across that floor, laughing wildly as he stumbled directly into my waiting arms. A sudden intense wave of profound, heavy grief washed over my chest. I placed my hand against the cold plaster wall and finally allowed myself to feel the absolute crushing weight of 40 years of devoted motherhood coming to a brutal, unnatural end. I grieved for the little boy who used to collect shiny rocks in the backyard, and the kind husband who had worked endlessly to build this beautiful sanctuary for our family. I wept for the beautiful future I had foolishly imagined we would all share together as we grew older. The tears fell silently down my face as I stood completely alone in the darkening hallway, but the deep, crushing sorrow did not last very long. The heavy, painful memories of the past were abruptly shattered by the stark, freezing reality of the present. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks and pulled my shoulders back. The innocent boy who had taken his first steps in this hallway was the exact same man who had forged my signature on a banking document to steal my lifelong equity. The child I had safely carried in my womb had aggressively conspired to lock me away in a bleak state facility simply to fund his luxurious vacation and cover up his felony embezzlement. My intense grief instantly hardened into an absolute impenetrable armor. I walked downstairs into the kitchen and grabbed my cleaning supplies. I spent the next 2 hours wiping down the countertops, sweeping the bare floors, and ensuring the entire property was impeccably perfectly clean. I scrubbed away every single fingerprint, every stray speck of dust, and every lingering trace of my emotional attachment. By the time the sun fully set outside the large bay windows, the house was completely sterile and utterly devoid of love. I walked out the front door, locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, and stepped into the cool evening air. I did not look back at the dark, empty windows even once. Before I completely abandoned the property, I had one final and highly satisfying piece of business to conduct in the kitchen. I stood over the large granite island where so many family meals had once been joyously prepared. Right in the exact center of the pristine stone counter, I placed the incredibly insulting glossy nursing home brochure Bradley had tried to force upon me. It looked completely absurd sitting there alone in the giant empty room. I pulled a crisp white sheet of premium stationery from my purse along with a heavy black pen. I did not write a long emotional letter detailing my broken heart or begging for an apology. I wrote a precise, legally terrifying statement of absolute factual truth. Dear Bradley and Chloe, I wrote my handwriting perfectly steady and perfectly sharp. I sincerely hope you enjoyed your extravagant, deeply expensive vacation to the beautiful Caribbean. While you were resting on the beach, I had a rigorously certified cognitive evaluation conducted by the head of neurology at Memorial Hospital. I scored a flawless 30 out of 30. My mind is perfectly sound and completely aware. Because my mind is so incredibly sharp, I easily noticed the forged home equity line of credit application and the completely fraudulent power of attorney document you attempted to file against my home. My lawyer has already handed those deeply incriminating documents directly over to the district attorney for severe felony fraud prosecution. Jessica has also been formally reported to the State Real Estate Commission for her criminal notary involvement. Her career is officially over. I paused and took a deep, satisfying breath before writing the final, highly devastating paragraph. You desperately tried to steal my house to cover your massive corporate embezzlement and your failing business, but you were far too slow and completely arrogant. I have legally sold the entire property to a ruthless corporate acquisition firm for pure cash. The deed is already transferred and the money is locked securely inside an impenetrable offshore trust. You have absolutely nothing left to steal. I taped the note securely to the bare granite counter right next to their foolish brochure. I walked out the heavy front door and found Marcus Thorne waiting quietly on the sidewalk. I handed the heavy brass keys directly to the Apex Holdings executive. Change the locks immediately, I instructed him firmly. He gave me a sharp, deeply respectful nod and promised the property would be locked down within the hour. I stepped into the waiting black town car and told the professional driver to head directly to the international airport. 2 hours later, I was sitting comfortably in a spacious first-class seat, drinking chilled sparkling water, while the plane climbed smoothly into the bright clouds. I was flying directly toward the warm, beautiful coast of Florida, where my newly purchased luxury oceanfront condominium was waiting for my arrival. I closed my eyes and smiled, feeling a profound, brilliant sense of absolute magnificent freedom. 5 days later, a sleek silver taxi pulled up to the quiet curb outside my former home. Bradley and Chloe climbed out of the back seat, looking deeply tanned and completely refreshed from their luxurious island getaway. They happily dragged their heavy designer luggage up the front walkway, totally oblivious to the catastrophic reality waiting for them. Chloe was loudly complaining about the minor jet lag, while Bradley confidently reached into his pocket for his house key. He slid the familiar metal key into the heavy front door lock and aggressively tried to turn it. The mechanism refused to budge even a single millimeter. He pulled the key out, frowned tightly, and shoved it back into the keyhole, applying significantly more forceful pressure. The lock remained completely immovable. Bradley let out an incredibly loud sigh of immense frustration and took a full step back from the door. That was when he finally noticed the strange metallic object hanging directly from the brass door handle. It was a heavy-duty industrial property management lockbox. The stark black box bore the unmistakable aggressive red logo of Apex Holdings. Bradley stared at the thick metal box with a sudden expression of total, absolute confusion. Chloe stopped complaining about her travel fatigue and stepped closer to the door, her eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar corporate branding. "This makes absolutely no sense at all," Bradley muttered, his voice carrying the very first faint trace of genuine panic. He quickly dropped his expensive leather luggage right on the porch and moved over to the large living room window. He cupped both of his hands around his face to block out the bright afternoon glare and pressed his nose directly against the thick glass pane. He expected to see the cheap gray curtains and the heavily staged modern furniture Chloe had proudly purchased. Instead, he saw absolutely nothing. The massive living room was completely hollowed out. Every single piece of furniture, every rug, every painting, and every single lamp was entirely gone. The room was stripped bare all the way down to the polished hardwood floors. Chloe rushed over to the window and gasped loudly as she stared into the stark, empty void of the house. Bradley frantically moved his eyes toward the back of the property, scanning the empty, formal dining room and peering deep into the kitchen. The entire estate looked like an abandoned ghost town. Then his desperate, wandering eyes finally locked onto the large granite kitchen island. Sitting perfectly isolated in the very center of the stone counter was the brightly colored nursing home brochure, and taped securely right next to it was a single crisp white sheet of paper. Bradley stumbled backward away from the glass window, his face draining of all color instantly. His hands began to shake violently as the absolute terrifying reality finally crashed down upon him. He had no equity. He had no house. He had no money to save himself from his impending corporate audit. The massive legal trap had forcefully snapped shut, isolating him completely, and they were irreversibly ruined. I was sitting thousands of miles away on my spacious, sun-drenched balcony, but my phone was securely connected to the hidden doorbell camera I had installed months earlier. I watched the scene unfold live on my glowing screen. Bradley and Chloe were still standing on the front porch, completely paralyzed by absolute terror. Before they could even begin to process the devastating reality of the empty house, a sleek black sedan pulled sharply into the driveway. A tall man wearing a dark suit stepped out of the vehicle holding a heavy metal clipboard. He was an official representative from Apex Holdings, and he did not care at all about my son or his supposed inheritance. He walked up the concrete steps, completely ignoring their designer luggage blocking his path. Bradley turned toward the man, his face twisted with desperate confusion. "Excuse me," Bradley stammered, pointing frantically at the house. "There has been a terrible mistake. This is my mother's property and we are locked out." The corporate representative did not offer a smile or a greeting. He possessed the coldness of a man who evicted people for a living. "There is no mistake, sir," he stated, his voice flat and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. "Apex Holdings purchased this estate for pure cash. The title legally cleared 3 days ago. You are standing on private corporate property." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic gasp, but the representative completely ignored her. He looked down at his clipboard and pulled out 2 crisp legal documents. He held them out toward Bradley with absolute robotic precision. "Since your personal belongings and various pieces of cheap staging furniture are currently locked inside the premises, corporate policy legally categorizes you as unauthorized month-to-month tenants," he explained clinically. "You now have exactly 2 options. You can sign this commercial lease agreement establishing your rent at $9,500 a month payable immediately in full, or you can accept this formal 3-day notice to quit for criminal trespassing. If you do not vacate the premises in 72 hours, we will have the local police remove you by force." Bradley stared at the clipboard as if it were a venomous snake. "You cannot do this!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "My mother is suffering from severe dementia. She is legally incompetent. This entire sale is a massive fraud." The representative did not flinch. He simply looked Bradley directly in the eyes. "We have a rigorously certified medical affidavit from the head of neurology at Memorial Hospital, completely confirming the seller's absolute mental competence," he replied coldly. "The sale is legally bulletproof. Sign the commercial lease or take the eviction notice. Apex Holdings does not negotiate with trespassers." Bradley slowly reached out with trembling hands and took the eviction notice. His absolute defeat was permanently cemented. My phone immediately began to ring the exact second the corporate representative walked back to his black sedan. The bright screen of my cell phone flashed rapidly with my son's name. I did not answer it right away. I let the phone ring loudly across my beautiful glass table. I listened to it ring 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I patiently watched the blue ocean waves crashing against the pristine white sand below my balcony. I let it ring exactly 14 times before I finally picked it up and accepted the call. "Mom, what did you do?" Bradley screamed into the receiver. His voice was completely frantic, vibrating with absolute pure terror. "You sold the family house. You gave our entire inheritance away to a faceless corporation. The bank is going to discover the missing funds, and I'm going to federal prison. You have completely ruined my life and my future." He stopped his loud screaming and suddenly shifted right into pathetic, desperate begging. "Please, Mom, you have to fix this," he pleaded, his voice breaking into ugly, dramatic sobs. "You have to call the buyers and cancel the transaction. You cannot just leave us out here on the street with absolutely nothing. We are your family. You are supposed to love me and protect me." I sat perfectly still in my comfortable lounge chair. I listened to the desperate, pathetic whining of a grown man who had actively tried to destroy my life just days earlier. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I felt absolutely nothing but the warm Florida breeze against my face. I took a slow, calm breath and cut him off completely. You thought I was simply a confused, fragile old woman, Bradley. I said, my voice perfectly clear and completely unyielding. You thought my home was your personal escape hatch. I heard you talking to Chloe in the kitchen. I heard you saying that putting me in a facility was the only way to protect your incoming wealth. You thought I was entirely disposable. Mom, please, that is not true, he begged frantically, crying loudly into the phone. I love you. I completely ignored his pathetic, desperate lies. I have forwarded your forged banking documents and the fraudulent notary stamps directly to the district attorney, I informed him clinically. You tried to build a cage out of medical lies to steal my lifelong equity. Now you get to sleep in the very cage you built for me. You have exactly 3 days to remove your cheap staging furniture before your new corporate landlord throws it all into the street. Mom, you cannot do this to me, he screamed one final desperate time. I looked out at the endless, beautiful blue horizon. A mother's love is unconditional, Bradley, I said softly, but her assets are absolutely not. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. I hung up the phone permanently. I blocked his number completely forever. I slowly picked up my chilled, sparkling water, took a long, satisfying sip, and smiled at the brilliant morning sun. I did not have to lift another single finger to watch the absolute destruction of the people who had maliciously tried to erase me from my own life. The heavy legal and financial traps I had so carefully set in motion executed themselves with absolute and ruthless precision. The district attorney received the forged home equity line of credit application and the fraudulent durable power of attorney directly from my attorney, Arthur Pendleton. Within 48 hours, the financial fraud unit opened a massive felony investigation into both Bradley and Chloe. The pristine color copies of the fake notary stamps were all the undeniable evidence the investigators needed to secure immediate search warrants for their personal devices. But the devastation certainly did not stop there. The State Real Estate Commission acted with terrifying and decisive speed. Jessica was completely stripped of her professional real estate credentials before the formal criminal trial even began. Her highly lucrative career in the luxury housing market was instantly vaporized, leaving her absolutely ruined and permanently disgraced in the industry. The aggressive criminal investigation quickly rippled outward and directly struck Bradley exactly where it hurt him the most. The intense inquiries from the fraud unit alerted the Human Resources Department at his prestigious corporate employer. The company immediately launched a rigorous internal audit of his financial portfolios and quickly discovered the massive embezzlement he had been desperately trying to cover up with my stolen equity. He was unceremoniously fired on a rainy Tuesday afternoon and publicly escorted out of his glass office building by armed corporate security guards. With absolutely no income, no secret savings, and zero access to my impenetrable offshore trust, Bradley and Chloe were entirely trapped. The cold, brutal reality of the commercial lease agreement they had been forced to sign finally crushed them. When the very first day of the month arrived, they could not possibly afford the massive $9,500 market rent demanded by Apex Holdings. The faceless corporate buyer did not offer them any gentle extensions or listen to their pathetic crying excuses. Apex Holdings executed a swift and completely merciless corporate eviction. A county sheriff arrived at the property exactly 3 days later and forcibly removed my son and his wife from the premises. Bradley and Chloe were forced to hastily pack whatever wrinkled designer clothes they could carry and completely abandon the expensive staging furniture permanently locked inside the property. They had desperately tried to steal a $1.5 million estate, and now they were miserably dragging their heavy luggage across the cracked, dirty pavement of a cheap roadside motel on the absolute worst side of the city. Their arrogant master plan had completely collapsed, burying them entirely under the heavy, suffocating consequences of their own extraordinary greed. I watched all of this profound justice unfold from thousands of miles away, completely separated from their toxic existence. I did not feel any guilt. I sit here now on my spacious, sun-drenched balcony, feeling the warm, gentle Florida breeze wash softly over my face. I slowly sip my hot, dark morning coffee and listen to the beautiful rhythmic sound of the bright blue ocean waves crashing endlessly against the pristine white sand far below. I have completely and entirely rebuilt my absolute peace. I do not spend my golden years sitting alone in a dark, heavy house desperately waiting for a silent phone to ring. I have created a rich and deeply fulfilling new routine for myself. 3 mornings a week, I drive to a wonderful local medical clinic for children. I sit in a brightly colored reading room surrounded by books, and I read beautiful, uplifting stories to little boys and girls who are waiting for their treatments. They listen to me with absolute genuine joy and complete fascination. They do not look right through me or roll their eyes when I speak. They do not treat me like a heavy burden or a confusing problem that needs to be quietly managed by professionals. They look directly at me, and they simply see a vibrant, living person who truly matters. And that simple, pure connection has easily become the most beautiful part of my restored life. Going through this profound fire has taught me the absolute hardest and most important lesson a mother can ever possibly learn. Love without absolute boundaries is simply management. You can spend your entire life endlessly giving away your hard-earned money, your precious time, and your secure shelter to the people you deeply love, but you can never actually buy their genuine respect. If someone only values you for the financial resources and the comfortable convenience you constantly provide, then they do not truly love you at all. They simply love what they can ruthlessly extract from you. You should never, under any circumstances, pay for the profound privilege of being completely ignored and entirely disrespected inside your very own home. Growing older definitely does not mean you suddenly lose your inherent human dignity. It absolutely does not mean you must quietly surrender your hard-earned life, your private assets, and your personal choices, simply because the younger generation finds your continued independence inconvenient to their greedy plans. I survived the terrible, tragic loss of my beloved husband, and I ultimately survived the profound, devastating betrayal of my only child. I bravely walked out of that terrible, suffocating darkness, and I built a brilliant new existence entirely on my own uncompromising terms. So if you are listening to my story right now and you feel completely invisible or quietly manipulated inside your own family, I desperately want you to hear my voice very clearly. Do not wait for them to suddenly remember your incredible worth. Do not ever hand over your house keys, your private bank accounts, or your absolute freedom just to keep a toxic, false sense of peace. You must actively protect your personal dignity at all possible costs. You must fiercely guard your resources and your beautiful spirit against anyone who tries to diminish you. Because your long life still belongs completely and exclusively to you, and it is absolutely never too late to firmly take your own power back and confidently walk out into the bright, beautiful sun.